101, so let's get started and folks can join as they filter in. Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Lunch and Learn on Maine's trees. We're thrilled to be joined by Brett Huggett, Professor of Biology at Bates College. My name is Abby Bradford. I am MCV's Outreach Manager, and my job is to help Mainers from across the state make our voices heard in the political process so we can protect our common home and our future. And Maine Conservation Voters' mission is to cultivate and use political power, protect and conserve Maine's environment. MCV helps elect pro-environmental legislators to office, helps hold them accountable without regard to political party, and helps pass pro-environmental legislation. A few technical notes for today's event. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. You can send your questions and comments as they occur to you to me, Abby, through the chat. And you can find that by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties, please message Will Sedlak for help. And this event is also being recorded, and we will post that on our website along with all of our lunch and learns every week. And you can find that on the homepage of our website, maineconservation.org. Our agenda for today, we will first be hearing from Brett about Maine's trees, what you're all here for. After that, I'll do a quick call to action so that you all know how you can get involved in the state's Maine Climate Council. After that, Brett will answer all of the questions that you all have, and then we'll wrap it up and announce next week's Lunch and Learn. I think that is it. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I will hand it over to you, Brett.
Great. How's the audio, Abby? Can you hear me?
Sound great. Crystal clear.
Yeah, I want to thank the organization for inviting me to talk, and thank all of you for logging on during this spectacular Maine day. I wish we could all be outside in the woods. This is definitely my first time doing a tree identification workshop virtually, but I would never hesitate to turn down an opportunity to talk about trees. So I'll tie in a little bit of some of the issues with climate change as they impact particular tree species, and then I'll also talk a little bit about my own research. But within the time frame that we have, I thought I would focus on probably, I narrowed it down to a top 10 list. These aren't my top 10 favorite tree species in Maine, but I think arguably the top 10 trees that you would most likely encounter if you were to head out your back door right now, if you're in the state of Maine. And these include what we would associate conifers on the left-hand side, eastern white pine, balsam fir, hemlock, and spruce. And on the right-hand side, some deciduous trees, so broadleaf trees, so sugar maple, red maple, ash, and we'll talk a little bit about birch and beech and red oak. And before you head out, or if you're out in the woods, there are several things that you should consider once you start thinking about identifying trees. One, think about the location that you're in. Pretty soon you'll start to tie in specifics about certain tree species, whether or not they're native or non-native. What is their range? What are their particular habitat types? If you're in a swamp, you're more likely going to see a red maple tree. If you're all the way on the top of Katahdin above tree line, you're less likely going to see that tree. So you start thinking about which tree species are going to be in the area, and it sort of narrows it down. And then what we're going to do today is we're going to tackle the next two questions, which you might want to ask yourself: does the tree have needles, or does it have broad leaves, such as a maple leaf? And then if it is broad-leafed, is the branching on the tree either alternate or opposite? We'll talk a little bit about that in detail later, but opposite branching would be similar to how your arms come out of your torso. Two arms at the same point, or two branches at the same point, and then alternate would be one branch at each node along the twig. So the first question, does it have needles, or is it broad, or does it have leaves that are broad and vein? So this picture to the left right here has needles. The next thing you want to ask yourself, are the needles in clusters, or are they singly attached to the stem? To the left-hand side is a picture of some white pine needles, and they're attached in clusters to the branch. Versus a picture to the right here, which is red spruce. Each of those needles are attached at a single point to the twig. So let's take a look at some of these. And first we'll look at needles that are in clusters. So this is eastern white pine. A lot of us are familiar with these species. It is the state tree. Well, we are the white pine state. The leaves occur in clusters of 5 needles. And this is really important, is that anytime you find a conifer that has needles attached in clusters, you want to first count how many needles. White pine is the only conifer in Maine that has 5 needles per cluster. They are straight, they are slender, and they're flexible. You will find some other tree species with 2 or even 3 needles per cluster, and that can narrow down your species identification. But if you find one with 5 needles per cluster, you have a white pine. Some people remember that as there are 5 letters in the word white. The cones are about 5 inches long. They're cylinder shaped with very thin scales, and they're often covered by that characteristic thick, sticky white pitch that you can find on them. With all tree ID, you want to start thinking about what foresters call the sylvics, like where do these trees grow? Not only their geographical range, but also their habit. This is a large, moderately tolerant tree found on a variety of sites. It's commercially very, very important. We use this tree species a lot for timber. Traditionally, it was used for ship masts. You can see that picture down to the bottom right there, where you could get a perfectly straight trunk and harvest that out and use them for ships. Prior to the Revolutionary War, the British had rights over any white pine trees greater than 24 inches in diameter within 2 miles of, I think, all major waterways in New England. And that was primarily reserved for shipbuilding, an incredible resource. And they would send out reconnaissance to find these trees, and they would mark them with their broad arrow signature with an axe. And if you travel around Maine, if you're in Freeport, there's the Broad Arrow Pub, and that's named after that scenario with the white pine tree. It is the largest northeastern conifer. It's common a pioneer. So this is one situation where if you are out in the woods and you're in a site that had been harvested or even clear cut previously, white pine is often one of the first tree species to come into that site. It will generate very quickly in these abandoned pastures, along with some other tree species such as aspen and birch. I would point out that we do live in Maine. It's the white pine state. Even our state flower is the white pine tassel, but I would like to point out that that is not botanically a flower. So we might be the only state in the country where the state flower is actually not a flower, but you can go on correcting folks after that and do a little bit of educating. These are actually cones. So they're cones that produce pollen, not exactly flowers that produce pollen. So if we looked at this conifer, again, the first thing to ask yourself are the needles in clusters or singly on the twig? They are grown singly on the twig where they're attached. This is eastern hemlock. Now, even though these needles where they're attached to the twig occur around the twig in a spiral, when the leaves develop and elongate, they all flatten out in one plane. So if you look at the branch of a hemlock, all the needles are flattened out into one plane. And there's probably some reasons behind that due to, maximizing capture of light in very low light environments. They're generally ½ inch long, but the first thing I do when I'm trying to identify this tree species is that I see the flat plane of needles, and then I look on the underside of the needles for what people refer to as 2 white racing stripes. And these are actually 2 lines of stomata, which are the pores that allow the tree to take up CO2 and release oxygen into the atmosphere. But they occur in these 2 waxy white lines, and that's a very good characteristic for identifying this tree. The cones are very small. They're only about 2/3 of an inch long, and they're ovoid or almost egg-shaped with scales with entire margins. And just a little bit of terminology there. The word entire refers to smooth margin on the tip of that scale right there, as opposed to a toothed margin. Again, looking at the distribution of this tree, it basically follows the Appalachian Trail nearly, a little bit farther west down in the south, but all the way, it occurs all throughout Maine. It's generally a medium-sized tree, but you can get some very large ones. Up here in the Northeast, it's possibly the most tolerant conifer, and that word tolerant refers to how well can it tolerate shade. And we often associate, and you can often find these tree species germinating in some of the underneath some of the densest canopy you can imagine. Like this picture right here is a hemlock forest, and down in the gully right there, you can actually see saplings of hemlocks coming up in very little light. They are very tolerant of shade and can continue to germinate and grow very well. This tree is heavily impacted by climate change, primarily as it's associated with one of the most devastating pests, and that happens to be the hemlock woolly adelgid. This is a tiny invasive species. It's an aphid that was first observed in 1951 around the Richmond area of Virginia. And since then, it has moved a little bit westward and has continued to move northward. And there are some speculations that as we have increased temperatures on an annual basis, but also winters that are far more mild, this species is able to quickly adapt. It has 2 generations within one growing year and continue to move northward. And this has become quite a problem because this insect will feed at the base of the needle. You can see in the picture to the far right, the little black aphids. It will actually extract sugary sap from the base of the needle. It can deplete the resources for the tree to the point where the tree ends up suffering mortality within 5 to 10 years. You can also find these insects, they create these little tiny white cocoons to the picture to the left there. These little white fluffy sacs, hence the name woolly adelgid. And that's a great characteristic for identifying trees that are infected with this insect. But as the winters have warmed up and become a little bit more mild, this insect has initially made its way. It used to be sort of blocked at the Massachusetts border, but it had made its way up into the valleys of Vermont, the river valleys, and New Hampshire, and now it's making its way up along the coast of Maine. And it's of great concern because of the severe mortality that it can cause in these trees. And there's been a recent update by the state of Maine to increase the proposed counties for quarantining infected species of hemlock. So for this reason, you are under these quarantines, you are not allowed to transport any hemlock saplings, any live material, or even dead material that still has foliage or branches on it out of these areas into the rest of Maine. I haven't come into contact with any woolly adelgid near where I live in Androscoggin County, luckily, but I have seen it down along the coast, particularly at Bates Morse Mountain. But it is moving its way up into Hancock County and has been sighted there. So another tree species that you might confuse hemlock with is balsam fir. The needles are attached singly to the twig. They can either be in that flat plane as the picture to the left, or they can be slightly curved upward. They're roughly about 3/4 of an inch long. The first thing I often tell people to do is do a sniff test. Basically crack open the needle, and if you smell that classic balsam fir smell, which you might associate with Christmas trees if you celebrate collecting a Christmas tree during the winter, or you might associate it with like those little balsam pillows that you can buy at L.L. Bean or other souvenir shops. That's a great characteristic for identifying the species. The cones are another great characteristic. They're about 3 to 4 inches, but they are upright, meaning if you look at the top of the tree, instead of the cones hanging down like a white pine tree, they're actually erect. They're structured straight up and they're pointing straight up towards the sky. Another good characteristic, which my daughters love, which is getting a little bit of annoying because they get the resin all over their clothes, are the trunk has these large resin blisters and they look like little tiny bubbles. I urge you to give it a try. You can walk up to this tree, you can find these resin blisters and you can press against them. Do be careful that your face is not too close because resin will shoot out of the blister in a straight stream. And I urge you to avoid getting it in your eyes and definitely not in your hair. But that's a good characteristic. It is found in the mountains and other cool sites, moist sites of northern New England. It's one of the most popular trees for Christmas tree production. This one in the bottom right is obviously pruned to have that classic pyramid shape. But you can find pretty large balsam fir trees down here in the lowlands, but you will also find it in pretty high altitudes if you're climbing up somewhere like Mount Katahdin. Another conifer with needles that are attached singly to the tree or to the twig is red spruce. Now these trees, once again, you can find them down here in the lowlands in Androscoggin County, but you can also find them well above tree line, even growing in what's called the Krumholtz if you're hiking up as high as the top of Katahdin, where they can grow almost shaped like a bonsai tree, where the harsh weather conditions have stunted the growth of that tree to grow primarily along the ground, grow very slowly, and have stunted growth. The needles are about a ½ inch long. They have a yellow-green color to them, and they are often curved forward, as you can see in that picture to the right with the cone. If you look at the needles, they're not laying out in a flat plane, but they're often curved forward. If you use a hand lens, which I'll encourage you to get one if you don't use one, the twigs are orange-brown, and they're often hairy in the twig grooves, which you can see in that middle picture there. And the cones are about 1½ inches long. They're rounded, but the important thing here is that they hang down. They're almost like pendants compared to that balsam fir where they point straight up. This is one of my favorite tree species because of the uses for the wood. Red spruce, which is also called Adirondack spruce by guitar luthiers, is a prized material for building musical instruments. The wood is extremely strong and stiff. It's highest strength among all spruces, and it's an excellent choice for the soundboards of musical instruments such as guitars. It was actually the preferred wood for airplanes in the early 20th century, and a lot of the pre-World War II guitars, which many guitar players seek because they're extremely valuable, particularly from Martin Guitar Company, used red spruce for the tops of the guitars. One of my favorite guitar makers, Dana Bourgeois, is actually in Lewiston, which very few people know about. He's in one of the mills near Da Vinci's. And that's a picture on the left there of one of his vintage dreadnought guitars with an Adirondack spruce top. And you can see the picture to the bottom right. All those lines are the growth rings of the red spruce. And ideally for these guitar makers, they're going to select trees that are growing very slowly and have very close growth rings. And that helps with the sound resonance of that soundboard. But winter spruce has also been heavily impacted by climate change, but also activity of humans. Initially, it was thought to be a canary in the coal mine. Starting around the 1970s, there were documentations of severe red spruce winter injury all over New England. And the symptoms of this is in the picture to the left there, is where in the middle of the winter, the needles will start to turn brown. They will lose their green chlorophyll color. They'll turn brown or yellowish brown and then die off. And this could push the tree to mortality, but it certainly slowed down growth rates of the trees. And it was initially hypothesized that it was due to acid rain. Due to the increased acid deposition, this was basically creating sort of an autoimmune deficiency that was preventing these red spruce trees from responding to normal stressors, such as cold weather. Again, this slowed down the growth and also the carbon allocation within the tree. But this is a really feel-good story because the same researchers that really focused a lot of time on this, such as Paul Schauberg up at the University of Vermont, has recently found that red spruce is on the rebound. And I mean, it is growing really, really well at many sites all across New England. Right here is a graph of just annual growth of red spruce. And you can see all the way from the 1950s all the way up through 2005, it has its ups and downs. But since 2005, the annual growth of this tree species is skyrocketing. And the authors of this paper, Kosiba and Paul Schauberg, hypothesized that it could be in part due to the Clean Air Act of 1990, which helped reduce sulfur and nitrogen pollution. And if so, this is a great example of science informing policy, policy being put into action and actually seeing results in the environment, which is a great story. And it could also be due to increased winter temperatures, cutting down on that winter injury. But certainly we do have indication that with reduced acid rain, we have less acid deposition and symptoms associated with acid deposition here in New England forest, which is a good thing. So that's it for conifers for today. So if you're also out in the woods and you find some trees that have broad and veined leaves, like this picture to the right, the first thing you have to ask yourself is the branching opposite or is it alternate? And you want to look up into the canopy or grab a branch if it's close enough to you. If it's opposite branching, you'll have two twigs coming out at the same, what we call node along a branch, such as the bottom left there. And then the bottom right is alternate branching, where you have one branch coming off at a particular node. The reason why I really emphasize this is because if you have a broadleaf tree that is opposite branching, it is going to be one of the mad horses. This is an old saying that even foresters use and dendrologists use, is that if you have a tree species in New England that has opposite branching, it's going to be one of what we call mad horses. And that's maple, ash, dogwood, or horse chestnut. So out of all of the tree species in New England and in Maine, you've just narrowed it down to these few select choices, which is a great way to attack this. So for the first one I wanted to talk about is sugar maple. One of my favorite tree species, certainly. The leaves are usually 5-lobed. So you can see to the picture in the right there that there are 5 distinct lobes along the leaf, and that the margins or the edges of the leaf are actually smooth. In the winter time, the twigs are brown, nice light brown color sometimes, with these sharply pointed buds that have overlapping bud scales, kind of like shingles on a roof. And you can see that in the picture right there. They're so pointy that they're almost like the shape of like a church steeple. And this is a very important tree species here in New England for many reasons. Obviously, we know for maple syrup. Also, it's a big contributor to our spectacular autumn foliage, which drives up tourism with a lot of people coming into Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont to do leaf peeping in the fall. Also has many other uses, for furniture making. It's probably the most popular choice of wood for baseball bats right now. I'm sure some of you like me is really missing the fact that we don't have Major League Baseball right now. But a large percentage of Major League Baseball players prefer bats that are made out of maple as opposed to another wood, either ash or hickory. This tree is of great concern right now due to the pest called the Asian longhorn beetle. And once again, this is another example where we have an invasive insect pathogen that's quickly being distributed and spread throughout the United States with the rise in temperature due to climate change and more mild winters. This was introduced into North America only in 1990, probably on solid wood packing material from Asia. Maple trees are the preferred host, but it will also attack horse chestnut, elms, birch, willow, and poplar. So here is a graph right here, a figure from the US Forest Service, just showing the forest types that are susceptible to this Asian longhorn beetle. And if you zero in to the state of Maine, we have a good amount of red right there. We do have a large amount of forests that have birch and poplars, and also a lot of maple that are of great concern if this insect were to get more greatly distributed here in the state of Maine. So another closely related species would be red maple. Now these leaves are generally 3-lobed compared to the 5-lobed sugar maple, which I put a comparison example right there side by side. Kind of like the hemlock, when you see what you think is a red maple, take the branch and look underneath the leaves. Often there's a disparity between the color on the upper surface and the other side. The underside of the leaf is going to be more of a whitish color compared to the darker green on top. The twigs are more stout. They have more stout buds with a reddish scales. You can see in that picture right there compared to the steeple-shaped buds in sugar maple. And this is one tree species where I sometimes rely on bark characteristic. I am not a huge fan of using bark characteristics to identify tree species because I think depending on what species you're looking at, there can be a lot of variability. These trees often get these strange target-shaped patterns that encircle where a previous branch was. And you could see this on the right-hand side, on that picture to the right-hand side there. This doesn't always happen, but when you see it, it is a red maple. There's no other maple trees or other deciduous trees that have this characteristic. So when you do see it, that is an excellent characteristic to help you identify that it is red maple. Another one is that these trees are often the first ones, if they're growing near water, that will turn in the fall, turn color in the fall. They do like to get their roots wet. They will grow right along, say, a beaver bog. And because they are pretty much saturated in water, the root systems start to suffocate a little bit, and the trees are a little bit more stressed out, and they're the first ones to turn color in the autumn. Now, another tree species with opposite branching is white ash. We do have a bunch of white ash here in the state, not as much as farther down south, where sugar maple and red maple had a single leaf that was attached to the twig. White ash actually have leaves that are made up of 7 smaller leaflets. And these turn purple in the fall. So look for what we call a compound leaf. So it's one leaf that has 7 small leaflets that are attached to the twig to identify white ash. The twigs are stout and they have buds that are almost shaped in almost the same color as a chocolate chip. The bark is pretty good characteristic as it is mature. They start off smooth, but once the tree matures at its later ages, they will have these interlacing ridges that you can see in that picture to the right there. That characteristic is pretty consistent throughout most of the ash trees. This tree is also susceptible to some of the impacts of climate change and the spread of the emerald ash borer. This was an invasive insect introduced again in the 1990s, likely on shipping pallets from Asia. And it's not discerning in terms of which species of ash, which is the genus Fraxinus, it attacks. It will attack all ash species, which is of great concern. We have white ash growing here in the wild, the native trees, but if you go anywhere into the cities, such as Portland or even Lewiston or any city in Maine, you're going to find a lot of green ash. These insects will cause mortality in the trees very quickly. They burrow into the tree and they disrupt the water and nutrient transport. And so far, the estimates are off the charts that this insect has killed nearly 50 to 100 million trees, ash trees. It's started primarily epicenter in the Midwest and has started to move east and north into New England. Control includes introduction of parasitic wasps, but another devastating control is that if you have a stand of ash trees, particularly in a city that are infested, is to remove all the ash trees, such as the city of Worcester, Mass did a decade ago, I think, where they basically harvested all of their ash trees and disposed of the material properly. We also have yellow birch up here in New England, and this is a great one that you can do with the smell test. The leaves are 3 to 5 inches long, and they're kind of oval shaped with toothed margins right there. The twigs, if you scratch them, will often have a wintergreen taste. And that's a great characteristic for yellow birch. As you get farther south, there's also black birch, which has the wintergreen taste. So be careful if you're in southern Maine or down into Massachusetts. The clusters occur, or the flowers occur in these clusters, which are called catkins. And these are often preformed in the fall and are starting to open up right now, depending upon where you are in Maine. And you can see those in the pictures in the center right there. And then there's that classic bark of the yellow birch, which has that golden shimmery kind of color to it, very reflective, that peels off in little strips compared to, say, a related species such as white birch or paper birch, which peels off in those large sheets of bark. So now we get into another tree species that's alternate branching, and that would be American beech. You'll often find these growing in clumps. This is a picture of a large beech tree that's surrounded by all these saplings that are likely just sucker shoots coming off of the root system from the parent tree. So it is likely that that picture right there is all one beech tree with all those saplings coming off of the parent. The leaves are about 3 to 6 inches long. They have very sharp incurved teeth, and they're somewhat of a papery feel to them. The buds are, most dendrologists say, they have a slender, almost cigar-like shape to them. A cigar the size that a mouse might use. And then the bark is that classic thin, smooth to gray characteristic, which people often like to carve their initials in. But we can also use it to track other animals. You will often find markings on the beech trees from bears. The reason why this tree is so important ecologically is that those beech nuts, which is the picture in the middle right there, are 22% protein. They're the same protein content as corn, but 5 times the amount of fat. So these are very, very important food resources, not only for squirrels, for black bears. And some studies have shown that in a poor masting year, or a poor year where there are not a lot of beech nuts, only 22% of reproducing female black bears reproduce. In a year when there's a lot of beech nuts, which we call masting year, you can get 80% of those reproducing females actually reproducing. The bears actually climb the trees to get to the beech nuts. If you've never seen a bear climb the tree, it's pretty amazing. And that picture to the bottom right is a video. So here goes a black bear that's going to climb up that tree. So the take home of that is not only if you're running from a black bear, don't go up a tree. They can climb very fast, but as they do climb, they, on that smooth gray bark, will leave all of those black marks, which you see to the left there. The 4 claw marks that are horizontal are from the hind legs, and the ones that are on an angle are from the front legs. They will climb up to the top of the tree. They will reach out and they will break off branches and kind of shove them underneath of themselves and eat the nuts. When they climb out of the tree, they leave what we affectionately call bear's nests, which you can see in that picture to the right. They don't actually sleep up there like a squirrel's nest, but they do leave that large clump of broken branches. So one of the last tree species I wanted to talk about was northern red oak. Again, alternate branching. The leaves are lobed, separated by regular sinuses, and often I've had even students say that the tips of these leaves almost look like flames, and that's how it helps them remember that red flames, red oak. The fruit is an acorn with a saucer-like cap with very small, tightly oppressed scales at the top there. Almost looks like a beret. And the bark is it's a good characteristic to use for this tree. It has these flat top ridges that almost looks like it's a bit sanded down, and then these very tiny shallow fissures, which is like the depth or the valley of the grooves, is often has a red color. And people often say that these look like ski trails going down a mountain. So we refer to that as ski trail bark, but very important timber species for furniture making, et cetera. And the impacts of climate change for these particular species, one impact of climate change, which is of great importance, depending on which model you look at, we are expected to have higher frequency of drought events here in New England with even greater severity. So one of the main focuses of my research is looking at water transport in trees. And taking some of you back maybe to high school or to college, water is transported through the tree, not under positive pressure like blood is transported in your body with your heart pumping, but instead water is transported in a tree all by sucking. Water is evaporating out of the leaves, and that creates a sucking pressure that pulls water up out of the trunk, out of the roots, and eventually water out of the soil and into the tree. And we call this the hydraulic rope. And this is going up through a whole network of tubes that are like the diameter of human hair, called the xylem. And the most devastating situation that you could have is if those conduits get an air bubble. Much like if you were drinking water out of a long straw, you're creating a sucking pressure that if I were to come by and poke a hole in that straw, it would introduce an air bubble that would break that hydraulic rope and you wouldn't be able to use that straw anymore. So that's the most devastating thing that can happen during a drought, is that and a drought is one of the ways that a tree could get an air bubble or an embolism form in that conduit. There's redundancy in the network though. I mean, there's a lot of water being transported, and 95% of all that water is lost to the atmosphere due to transpiration. And we're not talking about a little bit of water. Here are some small calculations. A large crop plant, such as a corn, can use upwards of 50 gallons of water a day. A large tree loses around 500 gallons of water a day. And as it's being transported up the tree, it has redundancy in the network. So here's a fully hydrated replica of a xylem network with all these connected tubes. If one of them gets embolized, water can be routed around that blockage and continue to be transported to the top of the tree. Much like if there's a traffic jam in the city, we have a network of city streets where you can get around that traffic jam. But if drought continues to become more severe or prolonged, that air bubble can then propagate from one xylem vessel to another. And if it propagates enough, that decreases the water transport into the tree, where the tree will start to suffer dieback and eventually mortality. So we know how water is transported through these trees. We don't know a lot about this network connectivity and how important this network connectivity is. Do certain tree species have a lot more connectivity within their networks and are able to respond to drought more efficiently because they can route water around these embolized conduits? We're not quite sure, and that's what my research is focused on. And one of the most exciting aspects of my research is to tackle this problem, how do you look at the three-dimensional network connectivity within a tree trunk, is that we take wood and we actually put it in these high-powered micro CT scanners out at the University of California, Berkeley. And we create these replicas. And a CT scanner, like you would have performed at a hospital or a doctor's office, takes thousands of slices going down the sample, and then it can render a three-dimensional image. So here is an image of a red maple root. And all of the blue and yellow are the conduits that would transport water. And we're able to reconstruct that entire network, and we can actually calculate with modeling software exactly how many connections can occur and how frequently they occur and how many vessels they occur between. Here's another nice video. So here's a cross section of a red maple root showing about 8 vessels that are colored blue and yellow right there. And that's going to be rendered in the picture below. And we can take these three-dimensional images, and also we can travel down inside them. We can tilt them around to really get an unprecedented view of this vascular architecture within these tree species. I always joke, and I was joking with Abigail, that we need some really cool music right here. So we use this method, and we use some more traditional methods too, to tackle questions which have been posed before, like where is the weakest link in a tree? And does that differ between certain tree species? Because this would have a huge impact for tree species on how they respond to drought. So is the weakest link in the leaf, or is it in the trunk? The weakest link meaning which of these tissue types is more likely going to form air bubbles during a severe drought? And we looked at 4 temperate tree species here in Maine and in New England, very common timber species, to tackle this question. We looked at red maple, beech, oak, and ash. And I won't go into the details of this graph, but other to point out that we looked at both saplings and canopies, and we were measuring in the petiole, current year stems, multi-year stems, trunks, and roots, how susceptible that tissue was to getting an air bubble. If the susceptibility fell to the left or above that dotted line, it was in the safety zone, that under severe drought stress, that tissue was going to recover and continue functioning normally. If it fell below that, to the right or below that dotted line, that tissue type would start to suffer failure. So we did this in saplings and canopies, and we lucked out by the fact that we did this work in 2016 in Massachusetts, and it happened to be the 3rd worst drought in 100 years. So we were being able to measure these trees at one of their most stressful periods of time during their life. And we found that the petioles, which is the little stalk that connects the leaf to the tree, will embolize first. And you can see all the petioles right there. Oops, sorry. And those dropped out first. And the hypothesis behind that is that the leaves are expendable. And in order to protect the vascular network that's within long-term tissue, such as the trees or the trunk, is that the petiole will embolize first and the leaves will drop off. Because they lose that point of transpiration, it shuts down the transport of water within the tree. And during a stressful period of time, it's sort of hedging its bet. But if you look at this graph too, and the take-home message is that with the exception of white ash, maple, beech, and oak have a much higher resistance to drought than we expected, which is a really good news story going on right here. And this is a bit reassuring, considering the predicted climate scenarios for New England, that both oak, beech, and maple are more resistant to drought than what we had expected. But red maple in particular was a real winner here. Almost all of the perennial tissues, the trunk and with the exception of the petiole and mature trees, were all operating under the third worst drought in 100 years, within the range where they could still survive and continue to maintain water transport. And this kind of reminded us of this theory that was put forth by Mark Abrams, that what was called the red maple paradox, that there's something about red maple that allows it to grow in all types of conditions and respond to all types of stress and have a huge geographical range, going essentially from all the way southern United States to the north from the Mississippi River eastward. Is that possibly this tree having such a strong resistance to drought allows this tree to grow in all these different types of environments. So as a wrap up, here's what we just did. We took all these tree species and we lumped them into, do they have needles or do they not? Are they broad-veined? If they have needles, are they in clusters or are they attached singly? And then in the broad ones, the first one you want to think about is, are they opposite or are they alternate? And I really suggest this tree or this book, Forest Trees of Maine, which if you Google this, you can download it as a free PDF, the entire book from the state of Maine. It's an excellent resource, and it has a dichotomous key in the beginning, which I urge you to use. And that's essentially what we've reconstructed here to the left. And I really I want you all to enjoy, learning all about the fine details of trees and getting out and getting a huge sense of gratification from identifying certain tree species. But I want to share with you one of my favorite videos right now from a YouTube channel.
This looks great. We can't hear any audio, is that fine? Brett?
Yep.
We don't hear any audio in the video.
All right, well, I'll narrate it for you. Basically, Lenny Pepperbottom walks up to the ash tree and says, wow, this is a big tooth aspen. You can tell it's an aspen just because of the way it is. So as much as I want you to learn all these details about all the tree species, the goal is for you to get out there and exercise it to the point where you forget everything you learn. And you could just look at a tree, whether you're driving 55 miles per hour down I-95 and say, oh, there's a white pine. And it gets back to this turn of the century philosophy called Gestalt, where there's a perception of oneness for many as the basis of Gestalt, is that you learn all these characteristics, use them as much as possible, only to forget them and get to the point where you can look at a tree and say, that's a sugar maple. So hopefully you all get to that point. That's it.
Thank you so much, Brett. That was wonderful. Can you hear me okay with these headphones?
Yep.
Great. Before we get to the Q&A with Brett, a quick plug, as Brett covered, Maine's trees are under increasing stress due to drought. And if you're wondering what you can do about that, you can make your voice heard in Maine's Climate Council process. They are drafting a climate action plan for Maine this year, which will include recommendations to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 45% by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. It will also include recommendations for the state to aid communities in adapting to the costly and serious changes to be wrought by the climate crisis. And it will also help us create a clean energy economy for all Mainers. If you would like to learn more about the Climate Council and how you can get involved, I invite you all to join us for a webinar next Wednesday, May 27th, from noon to 1:30 p.m. If you are not on MCV's email list, you can sign up on our homepage and get that invite, or feel free to email me and I can send it to you. Also, I will be emailing out a link to our petition calling for a strong and equitable climate action plan. And actually, maybe Will, if you'd like to send that through the chat, that'd be great. No worries if not. All right, that is my quick spiel. Let's get to the Q&A, the fun part. Again, you should all send your questions to me, Abby, through the chat, which you can find by hovering your mouse at the bottom of the screen, and then I'll select popular questions for Brett to answer. We already got some as you're going, and so we'll start with those. Leslie asks, how do you manage a quarantine when you're dealing with an invasive species?
Yeah, and it's a great question. A question that's more relevant ever now than before. It's very difficult to govern a quarantine. In some situations, certain states have posed fines for anyone who is caught distributing quarantine material. And some of our visitors to this chat might know, I'm trying to think if the state of Maine has any fines in place, because certainly we have severe restrictions for the transport of even firewood from other states, and that's to sort of cut down on the transmittance of these pests. You cannot bring any out-of-state of firewood into Maine. And even within Maine, there are certain areas such as Baxter State Park where you are not allowed to even bring firewood from the state of Maine into Baxter State Park. And whether or not those are susceptible by fine, I'm not quite sure. And there's been some real successful cases of quarantines. There's another disease that hits pine trees called white pine blister rust, which has an alternate host called ribes. In Cape Cod, you are not allowed to grow ribes, sell ribes, or distribute ribes. And they have basically eliminated that population of plants on Cape Cod and have eliminated the disease for that reason. So sometimes it can be, to answer your question, I think legal ramifications, either fines, but often it's just public awareness and education of the public, and hope that people abide by those guidelines.
On a related note, Susanna asks, how far north in Maine has the hemlock woolly adelgid spread, and what is the rate of that spreading?
The rate of the spread, if you pull up a couple maps, I would say in the last 10 years, it has gone from the Portland area all the way up into Hancock County. It's mostly staying in the counties that are along the ocean, along the coast, likely because the ocean is acting as a buffer and creating slightly more mild winters than we see on the interior sections of Maine. But if you pull up any of those state maps, like the ones I shared earlier on, they're pretty accurate in terms of their documentation of what counties have hemlock woolly adelgid. And I would urge you that if you are out in the woods, if you're a birder and you go to one of those counties, be careful if you're walking around hemlocks, because this pathogen is primarily transported by wind or birds, but it can also be transported by humans. If you spend a lot of time, bushwhacking through a stand with hemlock saplings that are infested with the woolly adelgid, it can get on your clothes, and then if you drive to another county and go birding out in the woods there, you can transport this insect. And there are certain situations, not to go on a little bit longer, but in Massachusetts, I remember seeing hemlock woolly adelgid being spread by the commuter rail, which was really sad. You have the whole commuter rail system coming out of Boston, and as the trains go down those rail systems right by Walden Pond, they're basically picking up and creating this whole current of wind, picking up these adelgids and spreading it westwardly out into the center of the interior parts of Massachusetts.
Right, people are sending in a flood of questions. I fear we may not get to them, everyone, but we will do some follow-up after if that is the case. And to answer one question, this is being recorded and it will be posted on our website later today, so feel free to share it far and wide. Here is a different question from Marianne, who lives in Falmouth, for some context. Why are we seeing so many acorns this year and young oak trees popping up?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there is a lot of science trying to understand how trees can communicate to one another. And there's been indications that trees can communicate even the presence of pathogens. So if certain trees on one part of the forest are infected by pathogens, they can also communicate to trees on the other side of the forest, which will then ramp up their protection against that pathogen. This can also happen with fruiting. Sometimes this is triggered by environmental conditions. Sometimes it's on a cycle of, several few years or even a decade. But it seems to be that most of an individual tree species, such as acorns or even balsam fir, will become synchronous in when they undergo reproduction, and they will invest a large amount of carbon reserves during one period of time to basically flood the market with acorns. And we do have several years where we have bumper crops of acorns. I'm thinking even a couple back around 2010 in Massachusetts, there was such a bumper crop that it was really hard to go running or jogging in Boston because of all the acorns. But it does also have a trickle down impact. It's very good for squirrel populations and other animals.
All right, this is a fun question. Oh, I've lost it, I just typed out so many. Robin asks, are there types of tree species that prefer to grow near one another? For example, white pine and hemlock?
In the sense that they have a similar requirement for soil characteristics in light environments. That would probably be the best answer I would be able to give you. We are starting to learn more and more about how they are connected through fungal networks that have a symbiotic relationship with these trees that can promote the growth of these trees. So if there are certain fungal organisms living in the soil that can form symbiotic relationship with these trees, it can promote the growth of similar tree species.
Which trees are most wind resistant?
Well, that's a great question. It gets into tensile strength, whether or not trees have come up with an adaptation to bend or not. If you're thinking about summertime, it comes down to leaf shape. If you are familiar with the way the leaves on a holly tree look like, or a tulip poplar looks like almost, it has a leaf shape almost like it has cat whiskers and ears. Those are incredible adaptations for wind. There is an amazing physicist who would study the biological world, and he would take those tree species and put them in wind tunnels. And as the wind increases, what you have is a broad leaf that starts to fold up and become this perfectly shaped aerodynamic cone to resist wind. Those are great examples of that. But in terms of other tree species up here, certainly red spruce is highly wind resistant. You can find that, as I mentioned, along the sides of some of our tallest mountains here in the state of Maine, and they can deal with a tremendous amount of wind shear force up in those climates.
Roger asks, do you have some general predictions of how climate change will impact Maine's trees in the next few decades?
I'm not on mute. That's a very tough question. I instead of having general predictions, I think I have more general concerns and real immediate concerns in terms of how climate change will impact our forests. And as you can tell probably from my talk, that one of the major concerns is how climate change is going to facilitate the spread of some of these either insect or fungal pathogens that could be extremely devastating to our New England forests. Certainly drought is a big one. Our research is a little bit uplifting, at least on the tree species that we looked at. But my biggest concern is that we're going to have to deal with some major fungal pathogens and even insect pathogens that are going to devastate some of our largest forest tracts. And Maine is heavily reliant upon those forests, not only for their ecological importance, but for the economy of the state. And it's of great concern.
Going back to an identification question, how do you differentiate poplar, also known as aspen, from birch?
Yes, so that's a great question. If you look at the bark from afar, they kind of look similar in the sense that say quaking aspen or poplar has whitish bark. But we're entering now the summer when the leaves are coming out. We're getting out of the time when tree identification is the most difficult, which is right when the buds are starting to emerge. But as soon as you get the leaves out, take a look at the petiole, which is that attachment of the leaf to the twig. In quaking aspens, that petiole will be flat again, this is another adaptation to resist wind. And that flattened petiole allows the leaf to shake in the wind. And that's why they're called quaking aspens. And that's one of the best characteristics. There's some other differences in terms of the leaf shape. The aspen has more of a heart-shaped or close to heart-shaped leaf, more of an oval. But look for that flat petiole.
Do trees sequester more carbon depending on their size and their age?
Yeah, that question is great. And that's been another area of my research. We are, as humans, hedging our bets and hoping that the forest ecosystems that we currently have will continue to sequester carbon at high rates to sort of offset the anthropogenic increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere. But the details of that are not well known. And one of the long-term research projects that we've done recently with some of my collaborators is that we looked at several different common tree species in New England and how much the carbon they sequester throughout the year. So we measured once a month throughout the entire year and all the different tissue types from roots to trunks to the leaves to see where the carbon was going, to see how they move the carbon around during the growing season, et cetera, et cetera. So to get back to your question, it's not so much large versus small trees. It's really dictated by how rapidly they are growing and how the photosynthetic rates are. A tree that is very healthy and can have a lot of or very high rates of photosynthesis will be capturing more carbon and hopefully sequestering that carbon.
Al asks, why do you often find rot in spruce fir trunks?
I wish I could ask him for a little more detail in terms of finding rot in spruce fir trunks.
Al, feel free to send me some details and I'll ask again.
In general, almost every tree you look at is not healthy. It has some sort of fungal infection in it somewhere, and a lot of them, and also bacterial infections in the tree trunks. And not so much in spruce and fir, but some of the hardwoods, you can get those large wart-like structures, which are called burls, which are often from bacterial infection that are sought after by woodworkers, particularly bowl turners, because it produces a very abnormal wood grain that looks beautiful once it's shaped into a bowl.
Dave asks, is your research and research like yours gaining traction with policymakers and politicians regarding evidence substantiating the reality of climate change and the need for action?
Yeah, I would argue that I'm a little disappointed in that, and I would take on part of that responsibility. I think, you know, often as a researcher, I fall into the trap of focusing so much on research because of the pressures to get research done. That translating it into the policy realm is a hard connection to make. Certainly we get funding because hopefully our research will inform policymakers, and in some situations the research is so accessible and so convincing that it gets a lot of traction and gets picked up by policymakers. But for most research, and I think for most researchers, it's another job to really advocate for your own research, that it should inform policy and that it should be considered and taken into account.
And great, let's work together, make that happen.
Yeah.
We are at 1:01. We did not get to all of your excellent questions, but like I said, we'll try and do some follow-up to send out. And thank you all so much for joining us on this beautiful day. Get back out there. And yeah. Brett, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Sure. Oh, a few notes. I forgot. Sorry. You'll all be emailed a quick survey after this. If you could take a few minutes to fill it out, we would really appreciate it. And next week's Lunch and Learn will be on Portland and South Portland's joint One Climate Future plan. That's it. Thank you all again. Thank you, Brett.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.